Black boy tells judge you're my mom. The entire courtroom falls silent. The courtroom was packed that morning, every seat filled with people who sat in rigid silence. The air was thick with tension, their eyes darting between the imposing judge's bench and the defendant's table. The case had gripped the community. A young boy named Elijah, no older than 12, was being tried for allegedly trespassing in a wealthy neighborhood. Elijah sat at the defendant's table, his small frame swallowed by the oversized wooden chair. His faded hoodie hung loosely on his shoulders, his jeans frayed and too long. His sneakers, worn and scuffed, dangled nervously above the polished floor. He gripped the edge of the table with trembling hands, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Across the room, the bailiff's booming voice cut through the murmur of whispers. All rise for the Honorable Judge Clara Hayes. The crowd shuffled to their feet, their movements stiff with apprehension. Judge Clara Hayes swept into the courtroom, her sharp features and commanding presence radiating authority. Known for her no-nonsense demeanor, Clara had built her reputation as a tough enforcer of the law, particularly in cases involving troubled youth. As she adjusted her robe and seated herself at the bench, Clara's gaze fell on Elijah. Her sharp, gray eyes narrowed slightly as she flipped through the case file in front of her, her expression betraying nothing. "You may be seated," she said crisply, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his wide brown eyes glancing nervously at the rows of people behind him. Clara's voice rang out again, commanding the room. "This case involves charges of trespassing and loitering. Defendant, you are accused of entering private property without permission. How do you plead?" The boy hesitated, his throat tightening. His public defender leaned down, whispering urgently in his ear. Elijah swallowed hard and finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Not guilty." Clara nodded curtly, jotting something in her notebook. "Proceed with opening statements," she ordered, motioning to the prosecutor. As the prosecutor began his opening remarks, detailing the events that led to Elijah's arrest, the boy's attention wandered. His nervous gaze darted back to the judge, lingering on her face. Recognition flickered in his expression, and his breathing quickened. For Clara Hayes, it was just another case, a child from a troubled background making a bad decision. But for Elijah, this wasn't just any judge. He stared at her intently, his fear giving way to a strange, unspoken certainty. He knew her. The prosecutor's voice droned on, recounting the details of Elijah's alleged trespassing. How he'd been found wandering in a gated community after dark, how a homeowner had called the police, and how Elijah had been uncooperative when questioned. The words echoed through the room, but for Elijah, they faded into white noise. His gaze remained fixed on Judge Clara Hayes, studying her face as if searching for a hidden truth. A lump formed in his throat, his heartbeat loud in his ears. Finally, he couldn't hold it back any longer. "I know you," Elijah blurted out, his voice cutting through the prosecutor's monologue like a blade. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom as everyone turned to look at the boy. Clara's pen froze mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" she said, her tone sharp. Elijah's chest heaved as he struggled to steady his breath. I know you," he repeated, his voice trembling. "You're my mom." Gasps rippled through the room, breaking the heavy silence. Someone in the back whispered audibly, "What did he just say?" Clara's usually composed expression faltered for the first time in her career. Her eyes locked onto Elijah's, scanning his face for some kind of explanation. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice low but unsteady. "You're my mom," Elijah said again, tears streaming down his cheeks. His words were raw, heavy with a pain far beyond his years. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The prosecutor, visibly caught off guard, fumbled with his papers. The bailiff glanced between Clara and Elijah, unsure of how to respond. Clara sat frozen at the bench, her heart pounding. She gripped her pen tightly, her knuckles white. For a moment, she didn't speak. She couldn't. I don't know what you're talking about," she finally said, her voice cracking slightly. Elijah didn't back down. "You gave me away when I was a baby," he said, his words trembling but resolute. "My foster mom told me everything." Whispers erupted again, louder this time. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, sensing a story far bigger than they'd anticipated. Clara's mind raced, her carefully constructed persona beginning to crumble. The boy's words hit Clara like a tidal wave, dredging up memories she had buried long ago. The courtroom seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in. She glanced at the bailiff, then at the public defender, whose stunned expression mirrored her own. I need a moment," Clara said, rising abruptly from her chair. Her voice cracked as she announced, "This court will take a brief recess." The gavel struck with a loud crack, echoing through the room as Clara fled to her chambers. Behind her, the courtroom erupted in chaos. Elijah slumped back into his chair, tears streaming down his face. Around him, the room buzzed with speculation and confusion. To the onlookers, this was an unexpected twist in a juvenile trespassing case. But for Elijah, it was a plea for answers from the woman he had spent his whole life wondering about. Clara Hayes paced the confines of her chambers, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The echo of Elijah's words reverberated in her mind. "You're my mom." Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her desk, trying to steady herself. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now. For years, she had buried that part of her life, locked it away behind her career, her title, her reputation. And now, that boy had shattered it all with a single sentence. She pulled open a drawer and retrieved an old photograph, its edges worn from years of being hidden away. The picture showed a newborn swaddled in a yellow blanket, his tiny face scrunched in sleep. Clara traced the outline of the baby with her finger, tears stinging her eyes. She had convinced herself for years that she'd made the right choice back then. She was just a teenager, scared and overwhelmed. Her parents had insisted it was the only way forward. "You'll ruin your future," they'd said. "He'll have a better life with someone else." But as time passed, she had never stopped wondering. Did he grow up happy? Was he loved? Did he ever think about the mother who let him go? The memories came rushing back like a flood. Arguments with her parents, the shame in their eyes, the crushing decision to sign the adoption papers. Clara had been just 18, a scared girl from a small conservative town, clinging to the hope that her son would find a life better than the one she could give him. She remembered the day she said goodbye. The social worker, Maggie Turner, had been kind but firm, assuring Clara that this was the right choice. "He'll grow up with a family who can give him everything you can't," Maggie had said. Clara had cried so hard that day she thought her heart might break in two. And now, years later, here he was, Elijah. Not the baby she had let go, but a boy, angry, hurting, and searching for answers she wasn't sure she could give. A knock on the door pulled Clara from her spiraling thoughts. "Judge Hayes?" A familiar voice called softly. Clara hesitated, quickly tucking the photograph back into the drawer. "Come in," she said, her voice hoarse. The door opened, and Maggie Turner stepped inside. She was older now, her face lined with years of experience, but her kind, steady presence was the same as Clara remembered. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Maggie said, her tone cautious, "but I think we need to talk." Clara stared at her, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. "Maggie, I wasn't expecting to see you here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maggie nodded, her expression softening. "I came because I heard about the case," she admitted, "and because Elijah deserves the truth. You both do." Clara sank into her chair, her composure cracking. "I don't know how to face him," she confessed. "What could I possibly say to make up for everything he's been through?" Maggie approached her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's not about saying the perfect thing," she said. "It's about being honest. Elijah doesn't need excuses or apologies. He needs to know you care." Clara closed her eyes, the weight of Maggie's words settling over her. She had spent so long hiding from her past, but now it was standing before her in the form of a boy who wanted answers. The courtroom buzzed with whispered speculation as the minutes dragged on. Elijah sat at the defendant's table, his hands clenched into tight fists. His gaze was fixed on the door Judge Clara Hayes had disappeared through. He couldn't believe it. After years of wondering, of piecing together fragments of his past, the person he had been searching for was here, and she had walked away. The door opened, and Clara returned, her face pale but composed. The murmurs in the room quieted as she resumed her place on the bench. She cleared her throat, her voice firm but wavering at the edges. "This court is back in session. Let us proceed with the case." But Elijah wasn't ready to let it go. He stood abruptly, his small frame trembling with the weight of his emotions. "You don't get to ignore me," he shouted, his voice cracking. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and the bailiff moved toward Elijah, but Clara raised a hand to stop him. She stared at the boy, her heart pounding. "Elijah," she said, her voice steadying. "Sit down." "No," Elijah shot back, tears spilling from his eyes. "You don't get to pretend I don't exist. I waited my whole life for this. For you. And now you're just going to push me away again." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The conviction in his voice struck her like a blow. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. "Elijah, this isn't the time or place for this discussion," she said finally, her voice soft but strained. "Why not?" Elijah countered, his voice trembling with anger and pain. "It's my life. I deserve to know why you gave me away." The courtroom sat in stunned silence, every pair of eyes locked on the boy and the judge. Even the prosecutor, who had been flipping through papers, seemed frozen in place. Clara felt the walls closing in. She glanced toward Maggie, who stood near the back of the courtroom. Maggie's eyes met hers, steady and encouraging, urging her to face the moment. Before Clara could respond, Maggie stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Your Honor," she began. "If I may, I think it's time for the truth." Clara stiffened. She wanted to maintain control, to keep the courtroom focused on the charges at hand. But the truth was already out, and there was no undoing it. Maggie turned to Elijah, her expression soft. "Elijah, you've been brave to speak up," she said. "And I know how much it's cost you to stand here today." She looked back at Clara. "But this boy deserves more than silence. He deserves answers." Clara swallowed hard, her mind racing. For years, she had hidden behind the walls of her career, convincing herself that the past didn't matter. But now, faced with the raw vulnerability in Elijah's eyes, she realized she couldn't run anymore. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "Recess," she said, banging her gavel. "This court is in recess." As the courtroom erupted into murmurs once again, Clara rose and motioned to the bailiff. "Bring him to the conference room," she said quietly, avoiding Elijah's gaze. "I'll speak to him privately." Elijah hesitated, his tear-streaked face betraying a mix of anger and hope. Maggie placed a comforting hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Go with him. This is your chance." The conference room was stark and cold, its white walls amplifying the silence that hung heavy in the air. A single table sat in the center with two chairs facing each other. Elijah entered first, his small hands clenched tightly at his sides, his breath shallow. Clara followed, her steps hesitant as though the weight of decades pressed down on her. She gripped the door handle briefly before letting it close behind her with a soft click. For the first time in years, she felt stripped of her authority, her judicial robe doing little to shield her from the vulnerability of the moment. Elijah sat down first, his eyes darting nervously between the table and the woman he had longed to confront. "You can sit," he said, his voice soft but firm, a strange role reversal that caught Clara off guard. She nodded, lowering herself slowly into the chair across from him. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her, fingers twisting together in an effort to steady herself. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was thick, filled with all the unspoken questions and years of pain that had built between them. Finally, Elijah broke the silence, his voice trembling. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you give me away?" Clara's breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. His deep brown eyes were filled with a mix of anger and sorrow, but beneath it all, she saw something else. The same eyes as the baby she had held all those years ago. "I was young," Clara began, her voice shaking. "I was just 18, and I was scared. My parents told me. They said it was the best thing for you, that you'd have a better life with another family." Elijah's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Better?" he echoed bitterly. "You thought foster care was better? Being shuffled from house to house? Wondering if anyone would ever want me?" Clara flinched, his words cutting through her defenses. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as she spoke. "I didn't know," she whispered. I thought you'd be adopted by a family who could give you everything I couldn't. I thought I was doing the right thing." Elijah's voice rose, his emotions boiling over. "But you didn't come back. You didn't check. You just left me there." Clara buried her face in her hands, her sobs breaking the fragile silence. "You're right," she said, her voice muffled by her tears. "You're right. I was too scared, too ashamed. I thought staying away would make it easier for both of us." Elijah's anger faltered as he watched her cry. The woman who had always been a distant, faceless figure in his mind now sitting before him, broken and remorseful. His hands unclenched, resting on the table. "Do you even care now?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling. "Or am I just a mistake you're trying to forget?" Clara looked up, her tear-streaked face etched with anguish. "Of course I care," she said, her voice firm despite the tremble in it. "You were never a mistake, Elijah. Not for one second. I've thought about you every day of my life. I didn't know how to fix what I'd done." The room fell into silence again, the weight of her words settling over them. Elijah stared at her, his expression softening ever so slightly. "I don't want to hate you," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But I don't know how to forgive you either." Clara hesitated, then reached out, her hand trembling as it rested on the table between them. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "But if you'll let me, I want to be here for you now. I can't change the past, but I can be part of your future, if you want me to." For a long moment, Elijah didn't move. Then, slowly, cautiously, he reached out and placed his hand over hers. "I don't know if it's enough," he said quietly. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's a start," she replied, her voice full of hope. Clara emerged from the conference room, her face pale and her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The courtroom was almost empty now, the buzz of earlier chaos replaced with hushed whispers. Only Maggie and Elijah's public defender remained, standing near the bench. Elijah followed a few steps behind her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His face was still streaked with tears, but there was something new in his expression, a mix of relief and uncertainty. Maggie approached them, her calm gaze shifting between Clara and Elijah. "How did it go?" she asked softly. Elijah hesitated, glancing at Clara before replying. "We talked," he said simply. "She told me the truth." Maggie nodded, her warm smile encouraging. "That's a good start." Clara cleared her throat, her voice trembling but determined. "I don't know how yet," she said, addressing Maggie, "but I'm not going to walk away this time. I want to do better for him." Maggie studied her, the weight of Clara's words hanging in the air. "It's going to take time," Maggie said gently, "but if you're willing to be there for him, you'll find a way." In the days that followed, Clara leaned heavily on Maggie's expertise, seeking advice on how to rebuild the connection she had abandoned years ago. Together, they devised a plan. Small steps, consistent effort, and above all, honesty. Clara arranged her first meeting with Elijah outside of court, a quiet afternoon at a park he often visited. When she arrived, she found him shooting hoops at a worn-down basketball court, his movements quick and deliberate, as though trying to work through his emotions. She hesitated at the edge of the court, unsure how to approach. Finally, she called out, "Elijah." He stopped mid-dribble, turning to face her. For a moment, he said nothing, his expression guarded. Then, with a shrug, he tossed her the ball. "You play?" he asked, his tone neutral but not unkind. Clara caught the ball awkwardly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Not in years," she admitted. They spent the next hour passing the ball back and forth, their conversation light and tentative. Elijah told her about his favorite players and how basketball had helped him cope with the instability of foster care. Clara listened intently, soaking in every word, every detail of the life she had missed. Over the following weeks, their meetings became more frequent. Clara insisted on meeting in places where Elijah felt comfortable. Parks, libraries, and even the youth center he frequented. Their conversations started slowly, often awkward and halting, but each one brought them closer. Elijah began opening up about the foster homes he had lived in, the friends he had made and lost, and his dreams for the future. Clara, in turn, shared pieces of her own story, her struggles as a scared teenager, her journey to becoming a judge, and the regret that had lingered in her heart for years. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench watching the sun dip below the horizon, Elijah turned to her with a question that had been weighing on him. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if you'd kept me?" Clara took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Every single day," she admitted. "But I can't change what I did back then. All I can do is try to make things right now." Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm still mad sometimes," he said. "That's okay," Clara replied gently. "You're allowed to be mad. I just hope someday you'll let me earn your forgiveness." He turned to her, his expression softer than it had been in weeks. "Maybe," he said quietly. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough for Clara. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile yet powerful beginning to the healing they both so desperately needed. The bond between Clara and Elijah grew slowly, like a delicate flower pushing through hardened soil. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of silence heavy with unspoken emotions, and times when Elijah pulled away, retreating into his familiar walls of self-protection. But Clara didn't give up. One day, she surprised Elijah by showing up at his youth center. She stood quietly at the back of the gym, watching him play basketball with his friends. Elijah noticed her immediately, his steps faltering mid-game. He hesitated, his expression a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. When he finally walked over to her, Clara smiled nervously. "I just wanted to see you play," she said. Elijah rolled his eyes but couldn't suppress a small, almost shy grin. "You don't have to do that," he muttered, though his tone lacked the bite it once had. But when Clara cheered loudly after he sank a perfect three-pointer, Elijah couldn't help but smile. Slowly, she was proving that she wanted to be part of his world. Not to impose, but to understand and support. Their time together became more frequent, and with each meeting, Clara learned more about the boy she had once called her son. Elijah shared stories of the homes he had bounced between, the foster parents who cared but couldn't commit, and the friends he had made and lost along the way. Clara listened with a heavy heart, her own regret growing with each revelation. She began to understand not just the pain she had caused, but the resilience Elijah had built in the face of it. In return, she opened up about her past, about the terrified girl she had been, the pressure from her parents, and the nights she spent crying after giving him up. She told him about her climb through law school and the bench, each accomplishment shadowed by the memory of the baby she had left behind. One evening, during a quiet moment, Elijah asked her, "Did you ever think I'd come looking for you?" Clara hesitated before answering. "I hoped you wouldn't," she admitted. "Not because I didn't want to see you, but because I was scared of what you might say if you did." Elijah nodded thoughtfully, his expression somber. "I didn't think you'd look for me," he said quietly. "Not for a long time, anyway." Clara's heart ached at his words, but she met his gaze with determination. "I didn't," she said honestly, "and that's my biggest regret. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Determined to support Elijah in every way she could, Clara reached out to Maggie for advice. Together, They explored therapy options and programs that could help Elijah process his trauma and build his confidence. Clara also began attending community events and workshops to better understand the challenges Elijah had faced growing up in the foster system. One day, Maggie handed her a stack of documents. "These are programs designed for youth like Elijah," she explained. "They focus on education, mentorship, and helping kids transition into adulthood. It's a good place to start." Clara pored over the information, committing herself to becoming the kind of presence Elijah needed, not just as his mother, but as a reliable source of stability in his life. Elijah, meanwhile, began to let her in, bit by bit. He showed her the books he loved, the music he listened to, and even let her watch a few of his basketball games. Their relationship wasn't without its struggles. There were moments when Elijah lashed out, his anger bubbling to the surface, and times when Clara wondered if she'd ever truly earn his trust. But each time, they found their way back to one another, their bond growing stronger through the effort they both put into it. By the end of those first few months, their tentative connection had transformed into something neither of them had thought possible. A fragile but genuine relationship built on trust, honesty, and the shared hope for a better future. Healing is never a straight path. For Clara and Elijah, the journey was filled with setbacks and difficult conversations that reopened old wounds. One evening, after an awkward family dinner Clara had prepared, Elijah finally voiced the frustration that had been bubbling inside him. "Why did it take this long for you to care?" he demanded, his voice rising with anger. Clara froze, her fork halfway to her plate. She set it down carefully, taking a deep breath before answering. "I've always cared," she said quietly. "I just didn't know how to face what I had done. And that's on me, Elijah, not you." But her calm response didn't quell his emotions. "It doesn't matter now," he snapped, standing abruptly. "It's too late to fix anything." He stormed out, leaving Clara alone at the table, her heart heavy. That night, Clara sat in her room, staring at the photograph she had kept hidden for years. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered to herself, "I'll keep trying. No matter how many times he pushes me away, I'll keep trying." The next day, Clara found Elijah at the youth center, sitting alone on the bleachers. She hesitated, then walked over and sat beside him. "I'm sorry if I pushed you too hard," she said softly. Elijah didn't look at her. "I just don't know how to trust you," he admitted. "I don't even know if I want to." Clara nodded, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't blame you, but I'm not going anywhere, Elijah. Even if it takes years, I'll still be here." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, Elijah glanced at her, his expression softening ever so slightly. "I guess that's a start," he muttered. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance of progress and setbacks. Therapy sessions helped Elijah unpack his anger and sadness, but the work was exhausting. Clara attended some of the sessions with him, though she made sure to give him space when he needed it. During one session, the therapist asked Elijah to describe what forgiveness might look like for him. He sat in silence for a while, then finally said, "I don't know if I can forgive her for what she did, but maybe I can forgive her for trying now." Clara felt her chest tighten at his words. It wasn't the resolution she had hoped for, but it was a step forward. Elijah also began to build new relationships at the youth center, encouraged by Clara and Maggie. He joined a mentorship program where older students guided younger kids through schoolwork and life challenges. One day, after a particularly rewarding session with his mentee, Elijah told Clara, "I think I want to help kids when I'm older, kids like me." Clara's heart swelled with pride. "You'd be amazing at that," she said sincerely. For Clara, the process of rebuilding trust with Elijah wasn't just about the present. It was also about preparing for the future. She began to advocate for foster children in her courtroom, using her position to push for better resources and support systems. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed by Elijah. Though he didn't always say it, he began to see that Clara wasn't just making promises. She was acting on them. One evening, as they walked together after a youth center event, Elijah turned to Clara and said, "I guess it's not just about me, huh? You're trying to help other kids, too." Clara smiled, her voice soft. Because of you, Elijah. You made me realize how much more I could be doing. Elijah nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. That's cool, I guess. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was another step forward. The courtroom looked very different from the day Clara and Elijah first faced each other. The gallery, once filled with tense spectators, was now occupied by supportive faces. Maggie, the staff from the youth center, and a handful of Elijah's friends. Elijah stood beside Clara at the front of the room, fidgeting nervously with the cuff of his shirt. Clara rested a steadying hand on his shoulder, her presence calm and reassuring. The presiding judge, a kind-faced woman, looked at them with a warm smile. Today, we celebrate a new chapter, she began. Judge Clara Hayes has formally petitioned to take legal guardianship of Elijah Turner, and both parties have agreed to move forward. As she spoke, the reality of the moment hit Elijah. For so long, he had felt like a wanderer, untethered and unwanted. But now, standing beside Clara, he felt something unfamiliar: belonging. When the judge asked if both parties were ready to commit to the guardianship, Clara answered firmly, "Yes, Your Honor." Elijah hesitated, glancing up at Clara. Her expression was steady, her eyes filled with quiet determination. Slowly he nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." The gavel struck, and the room erupted into applause. For Elijah and Clara, however, the sound faded into the background. They turned to each other, and for the first time, the walls that had separated them seemed to disappear. After the ceremony, Clara and Elijah stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by well-wishers. Maggie approached them first, her face glowing with pride. "You two did it," she said, hugging Elijah. "I always knew you could." Elijah shrugged, but a small smile crept across his face. "It's weird," he admitted. "But good weird, I guess." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft. "It's a lot to take in, but we'll figure it out. Together." Later, as the crowd thinned, Elijah pulled Clara aside. "So, what happens now?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Clara smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "Now we start building a life together," she said, "one step at a time." For the first time, Elijah allowed himself to believe her. The weeks that followed the ceremony were a whirlwind of adjustment. Clara worked hard to balance her demanding career with her new responsibilities as Elijah's guardian. She reorganized her home to make space for him, transforming a guest room into a space that truly felt like his. Elijah, for his part, struggled with the vulnerability of letting someone care for him. There were moments when he pulled back, unsure of how to trust fully, but Clara remained patient and consistent. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Elijah turned to Clara and said, "You know, I didn't think you'd stick around." Clara glanced at him, her expression serious. "I'm not going anywhere, Elijah," she said firmly. "You're my son, and I'll always be here for you." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Elijah didn't respond. Then, slowly, he leaned into her side, his head resting against her shoulder. Clara's heart swelled as she placed an arm around him. For the first time, they both felt the weight of their shared hope, stronger than fear, guiding them into a future they could build together. Clara and Elijah's journey was far from over, but for the first time, their lives felt anchored. The pain of the past didn't vanish overnight, but its weight grew lighter as they worked together to build something new. Elijah still had moments of doubt, nights when old memories crept back, filling him with the fear of being abandoned again. But Clara met those moments with unwavering reassurance. She reminded him, time and again, that he was no longer alone. One day, during a quiet afternoon at the park, Elijah turned to Clara. "Do you ever think about them?" he asked, referring to the parents who had pressured her to give him up. Clara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I do," she admitted, "but not with anger anymore. They made mistakes just like I did. But holding on to that pain won't help me move forward." Elijah nodded, her words resonating with him. "Yeah," he said softly, Maybe it's time for me to let go of some of it, too. Clara and Elijah settled into their new life with cautious optimism. Clara took every opportunity to be present, from attending Elijah's basketball games to helping him with homework and learning about his interests. Elijah began to open up more, sharing not just his struggles but his aspirations. He talked about wanting to mentor kids in the foster system, to be the kind of support he wished he'd had growing up. Clara encouraged him wholeheartedly, even helping him sign up as a junior volunteer at the youth center. The staff there, already familiar with Elijah's journey, welcomed him with open arms. Their home also began to reflect their new bond. The walls of Elijah's room filled with posters of his favorite basketball players and bookshelves stocked with novels he loved. Clara, too, began to loosen the carefully controlled edges of her life, letting warmth and spontaneity replace the rigid order she had clung to for so long. Months later, they stood together on the sidelines of a basketball game. Elijah had just scored the winning point for his team, and Clara's cheers echoed above the crowd. As Elijah jogged over, his face flushed with excitement, he looked at Clara and grinned. "You're embarrassing me," he said, though his tone was playful. Clara laughed. "Get used to it. I'm your mom. It's part of the job." Elijah paused, his smile softening into something more genuine. "Yeah," he said quietly, "you are." The words carried a weight that Clara didn't miss, and she felt tears prick her eyes. For the first time, Elijah felt like he had someone who was truly in his corner. Not just in words, but in every action Clara took to show him he mattered. And for Clara, the boy she had once feared facing had become the center of her world, the living proof that it's never too late to make things right. Together, they stood at the edge of a future filled with uncertainty, but also hope. They didn't have all the answers, and the path ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges. But for the first time, they both felt ready to face it. Hand in hand, they walked out of the gym, their laughter echoing into the night. A mother and son, finding their way together.